What's up, everybody? This is chapter 2 of The Tragic Deception, Marx, Contra, Engels by Norman Levine. The chapter is titled The Transcendence of Democracy. The French Revolution not only witnessed the ascendancy of the middle classes, but also laid the seeds for their eventual destruction. Bourgeois democracy triumphed in 1791, deepened into egalitarian democracy under Robespierre, and received a major challenge from the egalitarian communism of Gracchus Babeuf. In 1795, the modern history of communism began with the conspiracy of the Society of Equals, and thus the French Revolution was in fact the womb of two revolutions, the bourgeois and the proletarian. The dividing line between these two revolutions was the notion of equality. Robespierre and Babeuf, although differing on the notion of property, were in agreement in criticizing the Constitution of 1791. It was apparent to Robespierre and Babeuf that political equality had not brought social equality. The attempt to rectify the disparity between these two forms of equality was one of the major causes of the conspiracy of 1795. The doctrine of natural rights is at the heart of the bourgeois revolution, and natural rights theory was decidedly atomistic. Rights belong to the person rather than the collectivity, to the entire human species. Each person, as a particular creation of nature, was a repository of privileges. Every individual possessed the freedom, power, and will to do those things for which he was equipped by nature. The individual preceded the species. The only tie to humanity in general, the only social connectedness, was the prohibition that no person could interfere with, destroy, or retard the natural rights of another person. Bourgeois Democrats had given a political definition to equality. The common criterion bourgeois Democrats wished to apply to all men was political in nature. All men were equal before the law. Feudalism had been abolished, and with feudalism, the privileges of differential justice based on estates. Those were the principles of 1791. Assuming that political equality was tantamount to total human freedom, the men of 1791 never addressed themselves to the social question. They never asked themselves whether indeed another common criterion of equality could be applied to man, the idea of social equality. This avenue of thought touched upon the question of property, and it was exactly at this point that bourgeois political theory stopped. Conversely, it was from this point that socialist political theory was to begin. In a bourgeois context, the idea of equality permitted the development of enormous disparities of social wealth. Bourgeois Democrats ignored the extremes of luxuriant wealth counterposed to the ignobling poverty, as long as rich man and poor man both had one vote. This rationalization and justification of enormous property imbalances resulted from the peculiar juncture of the notion of equality with the labor theory, not of value but of property. The Jacobin answer to this fateful contradiction in bourgeois thought was an egalitarian response. Robespierre and Jacobinism were thoroughly grounded in natural rights theory. Nature had endowed each man with rights, and these rights belonged, quote, to all men equally, end quote. Atomistic, emphasizing that men were anterior to society. Robespierre affirmed that society could not invade these rights, but merely secure and safeguard these rights. In accordance with the idea of the social contract, Robespierre wrote that society and law were constituted to protect men. Property, too, was a natural right. As long as men did not invade or threaten, quote, the property of other citizens, end quote, each person had the right to, quote, enjoy and to dispose of, end quote, his property, quote, as it is at his pleasure, end quote. The democratic egalitarianism of Robespierre began when Robespierre applied the idea of equality to the social as well as the political realm. Recognizing the distinction of talent and skill, Robespierre adamantly maintained that political and social equality were rights, quote, whatever difference may be in their physical and moral force, end quote. No one, therefore, should be without property. Far from wishing to abolish personal property, Robespierre sought to universalize personal property. The doctrine of natural rights would be perfected when men were not only equal before the law, but possessed property almost equally. That is, shared in the, quote, portion of fortune or wealth that is guaranteed to him by law, end quote. Jacobinism thus carried natural rights theory as far as the left as far to the left as it was possible to reach. Even though Robespierre accepted the paternalistic responsibilities of society, accepted that, quote, society is under obligation to provide subsistence for all its members, end quote, Robespierre never challenged the sanctity of universalized private property. The Reign of Terror illustrated the radicalism latent in the idea of equality, then extended to the social question. The unresolved contradictions in the bourgeois notion of equality were explosive, and the Committee of Public Safety was proof of the unsuspected revolutionary potential of radical egalitarianism. Robespierre's faith in natural rights theory approached utopianism. Like Robespierre, Gracchus Babeuf also rejected the bourgeois notion of equality. Like Robespierre, Babeuf also rejected the bourgeois and Jacobin inheritance to the sanctity of private possession. By accepting natural rights theory but not the natural rights of property, Babeuf introduced egalitarian communism into modern history. I think a minor figure that would also might be fit into this position, although, I think Robespierre and Babeuf would be way more better known figures, but I think Gerard Winstanley of the Diggers in the English Revolution would also be part of this overall, it would be an important part of this communist intellectual history. Working within the natural rights framework, Babeuf maintained that equality was a law of nature applicable to all men. Where Babeuf differed from Robespierre and bourgeois interpretation of natural rights was over the question of atomism. Men did not precede society. Labor was not simply the attribute to the individual human being. Rather, man was a social animal. Furthermore, labor was a total social product. Since men and labor were contingent upon society, the doctrine of equality necessitated the movement to, quote, common property or the community of goods, end quote. A precondition for the evolution of socialist or communist theory is the belief that man coexists with the society. Unless man is seen as coeval with society rather than opposed to society, it is impossible to argue the logic of community possession. When Babeuf rejected natural rights atomism, Babeuf opened the door to a discussion of man as a social being. Therein lay his communism. But Babeuf retained vestiges of 18th century natural rights theory, particularly the idea of equality, and thus he continued the tradition of democratic egalitarianism. Babeuf was thus a transition figure, taking with Babeuf the accomplishments of the 18th century into the proletarian world of the future. Prevalent in Babeuf's writing was the theme of the coming socialist revolution as continuation of the bourgeois French Revolution. Just as the people had marched over the bodies of kings and priests in the past, so in the future they would destroy the new tyrants, the bourgeois capitalists. There was in Babeuf, moreover, a concept that bore tremendous relevance for the future of socialist thought. In attacking the idea of individualistic atomism, Babeuf also attacked the idea and implications of private egoism. Not only did Babeuf abjure egoism, but in addition the allied ideas of greed, selfishness, private acquisitiveness. Babeuf suggested that a new rationale must be sought for economic production, distribution, and enjoyment. Where property was shared in common, egoism would no longer be the basic motivation of men. Since everyone would receive the same remuneration of food and shelter, some other source of human motivation must be found rather than ego gratification. Marx's attack on natural rights theory was much broader than Babeuf's and indeed sprang from fundamentally different sources. Not only did Marx reject the idea of private possession, but he also rejected the philosophical notions of natural rights and equality generally. Since natural rights theory formed the basis of democracy, Marx had moved beyond democracy. Unlike Robespierre or Babeuf, Marx was forced to construct an entirely new social philosophy to correspond with his evolving theory of communism. Quote, none of the supposed rights of man, therefore, go beyond the egoistic man. Man as man is, a member of civil society, that is, an individual separated from the community, withdrawn into himself, wholly preoccupied with his private interest and acting in accordance with his private caprice. Man is far from being considered in the rights of man as a species being. On the contrary, species life itself, society, appears as a system which is external to the individual and as a limitation of his original independence. The only bond between men is natural necessity, needs, and private interest, the preservation of their property and their egoistic persons, end quote. Marx. According to Marx, natural rights theory was simply an apology for private greed. Viewing man as a self-sufficient monad, natural rights theory was merely an excuse for self-aggrandizement, both material and spiritual. Since the individual person preceded society, natural rights did not speak in terms of social cohesiveness, but rather in terms of self-contained atoms. Such a world was enslaving, exploitative, and gluttonous. In the critique of the Gotha program, Marx attacked the bourgeois notion of equality. Equal rights in a class society like 19th century bourgeois industrial society meant unequal appropriation of wealth. When placed in an unequal social context, when applied to unequal individual ability, the idea of right logically led to a disequilibrium of private possession. Right, therefore, was a poor criterion by which to construct society. It was a tool through which the bourgeoisie maintained their class domination. Labor, too, was a poor criterion. Marx's search, therefore, was to discover a new criterion for social relationships for the control of economic forces that categorically avoided class differentiation derived from property. Marx had to pass beyond natural rights theory, pass beyond the idea of equality in order to discover a new social ethic, a new mode of relating to productive forces that would not create class distinction based on wealth. Marx's surmounting of natural rights theory led Marx to criticize the accomplishments of the French Revolution. Even though Marx admired the persons as well as tactics of Robespierre and Saint-Just, Marx was also critical of Jacobin egalitarianism. According to Marx, the failure of the French Revolution arose from the fact that it spoke for the interest of a limited, exclusive class, the bourgeoisie. The ills that the French Revolution cured were thus the ills suffered by the bourgeoisie and were thus limited, exclusive ills. No one spoke effectively for the general universal ills of the total French society. Consequently, the general and universal sufferings were left unresolved. The triumph of the bourgeois class was thus the triumph of the ideology and interests of the class. Free competition ruled. Free trade was unchallenged. Private anarchy became the law of society. Bourgeois society witnessed the, quote, universal struggle of man against man, individual against individual, end quote. The brutal elementary forces of life were loosed from the fetters of feudal society. The modern political state had been victorious, and that state sanctified the relentless competitive struggle. The political state had dissolved the cohesiveness of the old society and, in the place of a social fabric, had superimposed the particularism of individual will. The French Revolution had achieved political emancipation. At best, this was only a partial triumph. The next revolution would gain full human social emancipation. Marx saw himself as the heir and perpetuator of the French revolutionary tradition, which had culminated in Babeuf. 1 second. What Marx substituted for natural rights theory and the idea of equality was not a creation solely of his own mind. Many people influenced him, particularly Wilhelm Weitling, Moses Hess, and Ludwig Feuerbach. Marx's own evolution toward a new social ethic was enhanced by his criticism of Proudhon and Stirner. These last two men, although differing in many areas, were the early founders of anarchism. The objections that Marx had to this form of radical individualism, indeed libertarianism, would help in an appreciation of the positive content of his new social ethic. In What is Property, Proudhon declared property to be theft. The man who took occupancy of the conditions of production and thus deprived another of accessibility to those conditions of production or equal ones did so by an arbitrary act of will. Proudhon was thus the man who took occupancy of the conditions of production and thus deprived another of accessibility to these conditions or equal ones was thus a despot and enslaver. Proudhon, however, saved his fiercest strictures for the bourgeois economists and the bourgeois economists' advocacy of distribution in accordance with labor and exchange. The problem that Proudhon set for himself was how to reconcile the idea of property whereby each producer owned and had free access to the conditions of his labor with the idea of equality whereby property producers owned equal portions of wealth and there was no terrible imbalance of classes. The solution to this problem lay in devising a new standard of distribution. Material rewards should be dispensed on the basis of capacity and result. Picturing a society whose task it was to fulfill human needs, Proudhon also pictured a society that contained a multitude of functions. Because modern society was so diverse, because modern society could not meet and produce a plethora of human needs, the functions to be performed by the individuals of this society were multitudinous. Consequently, individual capacities, even though obviously unequal in quality, could be utilized by society if rewards were dispensed in terms of capacity and result, and since every capacity and skill could be accommodated by society, this system ensured that every producer would be the recipient of material wealth. Although there might occur differences in wealth, this new standard of distribution in terms of capacity and result overcame the extreme schism between rich and poor in bourgeois society. This system could work if producers had free access to the means of production, that is, held the means of production as his property. In the Jacobin tradition, Proudhon did not wish to abolish private property, but rather to Catholicize private property. Human equality still formed the essence of Proudhon's search. Total independence of judgment and will, the fact that no man would look upon another as a sovereign or master, these ideas are what Proudhon defined as sovereignty. Radical individualism, the absolute freedom of each man's conscience and volition, formed the touchstone of Proudhon's thinking. Anarchistic federalism was the societal form that best incorporated Proudhon's ideal of individual sovereignty. Such personal independence could only be guaranteed if each man were economically sovereign. Private possession, for Proudhon, formed the economic insurance for moral independence. This attainment of such a social condition was a potentiality in the nature of man. The primary characteristic of human nature, according to Proudhon, was sociability. Anthropologically, sympathetic attraction caused men to associate in groups. Another aspect of sociability was the human tendency toward justice. Because man was sociable, man also recognized the equality between his own personality and another's. Respecting his own personality, he would also respect the personality of another person in his society. Justice, equality, and society were thus the inherent characteristics of man. Despite a penchant for personal invective, Marx, after an initial period of friendship, later attacked Proudhon without restraint. Marx accused Proudhon of displaying a petty bourgeois mentality, the defense of property, the defense of individualism. Marx classified as petty bourgeois mentality, the outlook of a lower middle-class ambition trying to enter the mainstream. In terms of knowledge of and competence with economic theory, Proudhon was no match for Marx. With his superior grasp of economic facts, his mastery of the English bourgeois economist Ricardo Smith Bray, Marx easily exposed Proudhon's rather naive handling of political economy. Most important, however, Marx attacked Proudhon because Proudhon assumed the economic categories were eternal. Justice, equality, and society were metaphysical entities standing apart from society, untouched by the rush and mass of daily economic activity. For Marx, Proudhon was an idealist, a Hegelian, an economic metaphysician who failed to see that societies were constantly changing, that societies were merely organic wholes based on a peculiar interrelationship between the means and relations of production. In short, Proudhon was not a naturalist. Above all, Proudhon did not understand the dialectic of naturalism. Proudhon did not see that as the means of production evolved, means of production constantly called forth new economic forms. Marx was a historicist, Proudhon a Platonist. That's actually a very good line. Marx was a historicist, Proudhon a Platonist. That is good shit. In many ways, the most serious challenge to Marx's own development came from Max Stirner. At any rate, Marx himself took Stirner seriously, and Marx devoted a major portion of the German ideology to a refutation of this adversary. The major threat of that Stirner posed for Marx was his denial of a universal human essence, a being of the species. A convert to Feuerbachian materialism and humanism, Marx had already adopted Feuerbach's notion of a human species being. In The Ego and His Own, Stirner launches assault on Feuerbach and indirectly, therefore, of advocates of Feuerbach like Marx. According to Stirner, men have always been enslaved to abstract, depersonalized spiritual potencies. The individual has always lost his unique identity, always surrendered himself, always became the instrument of these supernatural powers. First man submitted to the dark mystical forces of nature, then to the judicial anthropomorphic God of the Old and New Testaments, and then to the universal progressive forces of reason. Regardless of the name, the forces eternal to men has always been the subject of history, men the mere predicate. Feuerbach's concept of a species being in Stirner's terms was nothing but a continuation of individual enslavement to an abstract supernatural force. The concept of essence must be finally overthrown, and abandoned essence would be transcended by ego. The abolition of the concept of essence, its substitution by the concept, the absolute, quote, I, end quote, had ramifications for other important philosophical concepts. For instance, Stirner defined freedom as, quote, rid of it, end quote. That is, freedom was having no obligations, no commitments outside of oneself. If freedom meant the absence of external determination, will for Stirner was synonymous with power. To be powerful was to control, to have mastery over an object. To be powerful was to be an owner, that is, an absolute possessor of the world around one. The definition of property for Stirner flowed naturally from his concept of power. Unlimited domination over objects, that which was subject to the absolute law of one's will, was property for Stirner. There was a predatory note to Stirner's notion of property. Stirner's vision of man was that of a conqueror, of someone who subjected the world to his own purposes. Just a side note, there's like definitely a thing in Stirner of from my limited understanding of a certain revolt against bourgeois society, a certain revolt against he definitely has positive things to say about strike action of the working class. So this kind of, I don't know, I'm not sure if the characterization of him is kind of like a Nietzschean or some kind of libertarian is totally correct. Libertarian in the sense of how Americans use the word libertarian. Stirner's vision of man was that of a conqueror, of someone who subjected the world to his own purposes. Man was the master, and anything he could enslave, anything he could make submissive to his will was his property. Stirner hoped that man could make the world his own property. Marx's refutation of Stirner took many forms. Principally, Marx rejected Stirner's notion of the sovereign individual, the idea of a, quote, I, and, quote, personal will, existing totally apart from such social conditions. Self-determining appears to Marx to continue the Hegelian notion of consciousness. An idealist, Stirner merely empowered the, quote, ego, and, quote, the same forces of self-generation as Hegel empowered self-consciousness. Both Stirner and Hegel referred to subjectivity as the unconditional mover of the universe, in the same way that Marx attacked Hegel for his metaphysical obscurantism, so now he attacks Stirner. Blindly and mystically, Stirner had completely overlooked the actual social conditions in which the ego had to function. Ideas were not abstract eternal entities. The ego is not an abstract eternal entity, and to assume so is merely to return philosophy to the alienation and dehumanization of philosophy's religious and idealist form. Real men and real social conditions formed the basis of human history, and Stirner's espousal of the doctrine of pure will was an empty apology for petty bourgeois parvenu ambitions. One second. A more fundamental difference separated Marx from Stirner, however. Stirner's doctrine of the world, both physical and ideational, as a mere adjunct, a property of the ego, indicated that Stirner thought of existence in terms of self-enjoyment. The, quote, I, end quote, placed itself in the world to consume the world. The ethical basis upon which Stirner was drawing was the ethic of personal pleasure. The ego should consume the world for the ego's own self-gratification. Marx had a totally different approach to existence. Man had to objectify himself. That is, the species nature of man required him to be active, to modify. Through his activity, by means of his labor, man had surrounded himself with objects that were objectifications of his own abilities, his species being. Man then created his own world and his own history, not in the sense that man was unconditioned, but in the sense that the conditions in which man worked, or upon which he worked, eventually bore the unmistakable impress of his own powers. Marx then talked of objectification, while Stirner talked of consumption. Marx talked of release, while Stirner talked about hoarding. Pleasure for Marx meant the use and expenditure of human ability, while for Stirner, pleasure meant greed and personal acquisition. Marx wished to fill the world, to flood the world. Stirner wished to denude the world. The attacks on Proudhon and Stirner revealed to us the pitfalls that Marx sought to avoid, that he was moving away from the danger of natural rights theory, equality, and extreme individualism. In the 1844 manuscripts, Marx acknowledges debts to Wilhelm Weitling and Moses Hess. Moses Hess and Wilhelm Weitling primarily transmitted to Marx the principles of a new social ethic. From them he learned that the purpose of society was not material acquisition, not production, not labor, i.e. Puritanism in all its forms, but rather contentment. However, this was not the contentment of a Stirner, that is, the self-enjoyment of the predatory instinct, but rather the contentment that arose from harmony, from an equilibrium of internal needs and abilities. The Marxian social ethic was grounded in eudaimonism. In 1842, Weitling's Garantien der Harmonie und Freiheit appeared. Weitling indicated that the basic illness from which mankind had suffered was inequality of possession. There could be no harmony between people, no brotherhood between people, because economic differences divided men, embittering men. Furthermore, Weitling advocated not the abolition of private property, but rather private property's equalization. Not a communist, Wilhelm Weitling's voice was that of a devout Christian artisan. Wilhelm Weitling possessed a guild mentality, a medieval concept of a community of independent artisans living in harmony, partially because all had property in the same proportion. Weitling's breakthrough came, however, when he developed a new criterion of social value. The good society was the society that answered human needs. The fulfillment of human needs meant enjoyment, contentment. The best way to meet human needs was through the unstinted expansion of human abilities. Needs would call forth abilities. The full exercise of abilities would in turn create new needs. Weitling maintained that a good society constructed a balance between human needs and abilities. Such a harmony prevented friction, discontent, anxiety. Weitling was describing a society that corresponded to the anthropological condition of man. Contentment could only be achieved if the natural exponent of human existence was fulfilled. Weitling wished for social eudaimonism. The reconstruction of the social world must be predicated on the fulfillment of the anthropological basis of human existence. Moses Hess followed a similar quest. Communism for Hess had less to do with the institutional or economic organization of society than with the creation of unity of life. Communism was humanitarianism. That is, in a communist society, man must be at one with his own nature. He must live in accordance with his own anthropological being. This meant for Moses Hess that human activity must be human activity's own enjoyment. It was not the rewards of human activity, but rather the activity itself that was pleasurable and therefore brought contentment. For Hess and for Weitling, personal happiness and well-being would be the ethical values of a new society. Work implied slavery for Moses Hess, but the term, quote, by the term, quote, work, end quote, Hess understood an activity that was either under the control of another or devoted toward the acquisition of an external object. In either case, the human activity was not free. That is, the human activity was not related to itself. A free act for Hess, a communist act, was one that was self-determining. This did not mean that the act was unconditioned, unlimited. A self-determined and therefore free act was an act that sprang from the inner nature of the organism. When Hess said pleasure and well-being were the end of life, Hess meant that an organism that obeyed its own nature was happy. From this vantage point, Marx's attack upon democratic theory emerges not as a mere legalistic refutation, but a transcendence. When Marx abjured democracy, he did so not only because of the atomism inherent in natural rights theory, not only because democratic individualism served as an apology for private greed, but rather because the value system, the ethical substratum of democracy, appeared to him as decadent, because Marx's flight from democracy was caused in part by his revulsion at the morality of democracy. So his evolution to communism was encouraged by the attractiveness of the morality of communism. This is not to claim that Marx was primarily a moralist. It is to claim, however, that Marx's communism cannot be described solely as a sociology of communalism or as a philosophical overcoming of alienation, but also as an attempt to construct a morality of human well-being. In order to amplify and make specific the above assertions, Marx's attempt to create a moral system for communism will be discussed in terms of his concept of self, freedom, power, and property. The bourgeois concern for self, as an entity independent of society, was merely an ideological ploy for the defense of capitalism, according to Marx. Democratic theory that saw man as distinct from society, indeed is in conflict with society, not only encouraged selfish acquisitiveness, but also human isolation, the alienation of man from man. For Marx, all individualistic systems suffered from this inherent flaw. By posting an ineradicable schism between man and man, individualistic systems did violence to the interdependence of social existence, alienated man from man's species, and therefore man from man's own nature. Individualism always tended to dehumanize man. That is, separate man from his species' nature. Individualism was a form of idealism, for it always posited a consciousness, a mentality that existed apart from the social world. Individualism was always mystification, for it completely ignored the social and naturalistic components of human life. Marx therefore abjured any form of individualism, be it based upon the democratic theory of natural rights or be it based on the anarchistic theory of ego as God. To define self in these terms was to define self in nothing was to define self in terms of non-being. Self for Marx was inherently social, and because man was in society, man achieved his fulfillment through society. Adopting the Feuerbachian notion of a universal human nature, Marx understood that man could only be himself when he was at the same time for other men. It was not that Marx did not think in terms of personal identity, but rather that Marx defined identity as arising only when man acted in accordance with man's true nature, that is, acted socially in interdependence with other men. The value that Marx was affirming was the value of interdependence. The world was by nature interpersonal, because social life was the ground from which individuality arose. Reference to the species was immediately reference to the self. Species affirmation was self-affirmation. If individualistic doctrines were a form of idealism, that is, if individualistic theories posit the existence of self-generating consciousness, then freedom in these doctrines must also be seen as self-produced. In other words, if freedom is to be self-produced, actions must be taken only in relation to the self-generating consciousness and therefore must be entirely devoid of social conditions. Such a philosophic construct immediately sets the stage for the problem of free will versus determinism, for it is obvious that the social conditions cannot be totally eliminated from human actions. Weitling and Hess both rejected this individualistic bourgeois concept of freedom. Weitling wrote, quote, "There is no comprehensive notion of human freedom, and there can be none which is not grounded on the naturalistic border of this freedom, namely human abilities," end quote. Wilhelm Weitling. Moses Hess uttered similar opinions, quote, "That being is free, which in order to live and be effective requires no force but its own nature, and thus enjoys unhindered activity," end quote. Moses Hess. Both men rejected the approach to freedom that was predicated upon self-generating consciousness and will. Rather, they began their quest from naturalistic anthropological presuppositions. Freedom must relate to the species nature of man. Therefore, man was immediately conditioned by his society as well as by his universal biological nature. For Moses Hess and Wilhelm Weitling, freedom did not mean, quote, riddance from, end quote, but rather, quote, access to, end quote. Given the determination of society and species nature, if a man could act so as to affirm his own nature, act in fulfillment of his needs and abilities, he was free. If the individual could exercise his organic requirements, if it were available to the being to express its own naturalistic essence, he was free. Individualistic bourgeois concepts of freedom talked of riddance, absence of the external, self-postulation, while communal communist theory talked of exercise, availability, and accessibility of one's own biological substrata. Weitling was to carry the argument a step further. Weitling did not define freedom as, quote, performance of, end quote, not to suffer from unfulfilled need and unexpressed talent was freedom. Not to suffer from unfulfilled need and unexpressed talent was freedom. If the organism could escape the discomfort, anxiety, dysfunction that would arise from not being able to function as its nature dictated, it was free. Again, a eudaimonistic note appears. Happiness was freedom. Marx followed along a similar line of development to Weitling and Hess. Perceptively, Marx saw the bourgeois notion of freedom as, quote, riddance from, end quote, where merely idealist abstractions. In part, they were continuations of religious, i.e., Christian notions of freedom, to be rid of this world, to be free and at home in a self-moving God. Idealist notions of freedom, then, were imbued by a certain otherworldliness, a desire to escape this earthly society. For Marx, to live was to be conditioned. Existence did not precede essence, rather essence preceded existence, and the essence of man was his species being. Therefore, essence was inherently interpersonal, inherently intrasocial. Every act taken by a man was determined by his biological nature, by his society, and by the material and productive means he found before him. If essence, species being, preceded existence, then all actions were conditioned and determined by that essence. Freedom for Marx, then, could only mean action in harmony with our essence, thinking not in terms of rights, but rather of gratifying anthropological characteristics. Marx defined free activity as, quote, the creative manifestation of life arising from the free development of all abilities, end quote. Like Waitling, Marx understood that freedom was an expression of fulfilled human abilities, an expression of gratified human need, quote, the all-round development of the individual, end quote. Marx, too, then equated freedom with human well-being. The correspondence of performance and ability, eudaimonism, was the value Marx sought to proclaim. If freedom for the bourgeoisie meant, quote, freedom from, end quote, then power for the bourgeoisie meant, quote, control over, end quote. In a world of objects, in a world of private property, power was defined in an imperial sense as dominion. It will be recalled that the bourgeois defense of private possession rested on the labor theory of property. An object became a man's property because he placed his labor in it. His labor took occupancy of the object. Since it was impossible to separate a man from his labor, it was impossible to separate the object from the man. Therefore, the object was as much his or his own labor was as much his as his own labor was, and he could control it free from any external interference. He could utilize the object as he wished, consume it in any fashion he willed. It was, in fact, his own imperium, and he was imperator. Power for Marx bore no such connotation. Rejecting the labor theory of property, the idea of freedom is, quote, riddance, end quote. Marx approached the question of power from a naturalistic point of view. When Marx referred to power, he used the word Vermögen, which meant, quote, ability, faculty, capable, end quote. In Marx's lexicon, power had nothing to do with imperium, but dealt rather with full development. A man was powerful not because man could control, not because objects or people were extensions of his sovereign will, but rather because he had developed his human abilities to their fullest extent. Powerfulness was therefore synonymous with self-development, that is, the perfection of the proper functions of men. Marx was defining power as the Greeks had defined virtue. The bourgeoisie were defining power again from a Christian perspective as something akin to self-contained God. The question of property for Marx centered, obviously, not around private possession, but around accessibility to the conditions of labor. It was the nature of man to labor. He must labor, modify the world around him if he was to continue his existence, reproduce his species. The means of production at his disposal, the conditions of his labor, were essential to his own self-reproduction. The conditions of labor, then, indispensable for his continued existence, must be accessible to his modifying activity. The conditions of labor must become generalized property. That is, the means of production must be freely available to the activity of the species. Property for Marx must be universal private property, for it must be universally accessible to the entire species and therefore belong to the entire species. In defining property as open accessibility to the means of production, Marx completely surmounted the bourgeois involvement with equality. Since the conditions of labor did not belong separately to individual men, the question of equality did not arise. Since the means of production were not possessed by private persons, the problem of distribution in equal shares through labor by way of exchange of equal products was completely transcended. By way of exchange of equal products was completely... Since the means of production were not possessed by private persons, the problem of distribution in equal shares through labor by way of exchange of equal products was completely transcended. Universal ownership introduced a new phase of human history, the phase of full human development. Marx was concerned not with equality, but with the perfection of human ability. The transcendence of bourgeois property was the beginning of the full productive development of the species. Marx's search for an ethic of human well-being continued, although in an altered form in his Grundrisse and Capital. The humanism of Marx was a constant element in his thought throughout his life. However, where the concerns of his early writings were straightforwardly anthropological, in his later writings, the anthropological was seen within the context of the economic. In his later work, Marx thought a set of socioeconomic presuppositions were necessary before any new ethic would be achieved. In fact, an ethic of human well-being must be a historical product. A new morality would not be possible unless the productive powers of man created the sociological presuppositions that could call this ethic into existence. In the Grundrisse, Marx continued to talk in terms of the, quote, universal development of the individual, end quote. Marx tried to demonstrate how full development was impossible inside capitalist society because of the barriers to full production, the inherent contradictions of the private enterprise system. In order for the individual to achieve this full development, it was first necessary for the, quote, full development of the forces of production, end quote, to become, quote, the condition of production, end quote. In Capital, Marx returned to the same theme. The unstinted productivity of industrial potential would mean less time devoted to necessary labor and thus more free time to be spent on developing capacities of the individual. In addition, the greater and ceaselessly expanding productive power would itself open up new areas of self-expression and self-actualization. Thus, in his later writings, Marx continued to redefine the concepts of self, freedom, power, and property. With the expanded productivity, human beings would have greater opportunity to actualize and express their inherent capacities. Since the condition of labor, the instruments of production will belong to all, the self-expression of the individual will be indistinguishable and inseparable from the self-expression of society generally. Indeed, in the Grundrisse, Marx approached a definition of the idea of civilization. Because of industrial process, civilization was a society that allowed for the full expression of individual talents, abilities, skills that created new areas for individual and societal self-actualization. Conversely, capitalism was barbarism. Capitalism dehumanized because capitalism expropriated full living labor and full living time from the individual and thus left him emptied and misshapen. A shift of emphasis had taken place in the mature Marx. In the early Marx, the emphasis was upon the anthropological precondition. In the Grundrisse and Capital, the emphasis was upon the sociological precondition. The conquest of his new ideas of self, freedom, power, and property was contingent upon the coming into existence of the necessary sociological preconditions. The formula that Marx expounded in the Critique of the Gotha program, quote, from each according to his ability to each according to his need, end quote, was thus an attempt to formulate a new ethical criterion for social relationships. Clearly, Marx was not primarily a moralist, but it is not an overstatement to assert that when Marx criticized democracy, he also criticized democratic values. On one level, Marx's humanism was a search for a transvaluation of value. He desired an anthropocentric society. He hoped for a society whose ethic was the harmonious balance of need and ability. His central concern was eudaimonism, a society in which the naturalistic components of human life were in harmony with societal existence. The end. Thanks for listening. I'm going to read the footnotes if you want to continue to hear more. George Lichtheim, The Origins of Socialism. Arthur Rosenberg, Democracy and Socialism. Lorenz von Stein, The History of Social Movement in France, 1789 to 1850, edited and translated by Kata Mengelberg. On this question, see the following works: John Locke, Two Treatises on Government; Crawford McPherson, The Political Theory of Possessive Individualism; Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations. P. Buonarroti, Beauvouf's Conspiracy for Equality; Karl Marx on the Jewish Question; Critique of the Gotha Program, The Holy Family; Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, What is Property; Poverty Philosophy; Max Stirner, The Ego and His Own; The German Ideology; Marx Early Writings; Wilhelm Weitling, Garantien der Harmonie und Freiheit. I guess that's Guarantee of Harmony and Freedom. Moses Hess, Philosophische und Sozialistische Schriften. Marx, Free Human Production. Yeah. So that's it. Thanks for listening.